All right, we have Leslie Stein, au naturel, with no slides.
Well, you might wonder who I am and what I'm doing here.
Yeah, who?
I don't know.
Who are any of us? Why are any of us
I
here?
just drifted in a little while ago. But I'm approaching this topic as a Jungian analyst. That's what I do now, even though I'm at the University of Sydney in another capacity. And I want to take this as a useful lens with which to analyze the question of who or what experiences nothingness, because psychoanalysis is entirely focused on subjective experiences, which include a wide range of mystical experiences, revelatory experiences, and I want to answer that question that I asked Dean earlier on. What happens with us? What do we do with the infinite? What you call it, the infinite unmanifest? How do we manifest it in ourselves, and how do we do that? Now, these sort of mystical and numinous experiences are always presented in their telling as a single narrative, much like one would set out a dream. But I've concentrated over the last 10 years on trying to break down the different stages of that experience, to look at the effect on each possible shift in psyche that occurs in each stage of it. And I base the comments today mainly on the interviews that I did with 29 mystics who were the subjects of my book, Working with Mystical Experience and Psychoanalysis. In this book, I attempted to really establish and report on the stages of their changing subjective states that transpired as the mystical experiences unfolded. To do that, I interviewed more than that, but 29 were really coherent. I went to the Mahakumbha Mela, which was in India, in Allahabad, where 30 million people, and one boy from the Bronx was there, which was me. And I then went to Wat Pa Pong in Thailand, Ajahn Chah's monastery, and also to two monasteries in Cambodia. And I wanted to really choose those people who was their path in life, and also had so many mystical experiences that it wasn't a sort of emotional discussion, but rather they were able to be very straightforward about what happened and what stages they went through and so on. Now, before I begin, in light of all the stuff we've talked about today, I want to make two reservations. The first is that I look at these stages without any reference to their doctrinal orientation, because these doctrines differ widely, for instance, between Buddhist and Vedic traditions. I'm strongly influenced to avoid these by listening to a man called Gayananda Bharati, who was a professor at Syracuse University. He became one of the first well-known sadhus or monks in India. And when he was finished, he went to describe, finished with that before he went back to the university. By the way, I asked him for his CV, and it came in a large cardboard box, which I thought was never seen before. But I asked him really about what happened in Thailand when he went to visit the Thai monks. And he said, I talked about my experience of being absorbed into the Brahman, and they were listening in terms of gap and secession, and they thought I was mad. So the two doctrinal positions are so different that I'm excluding them for this conversation. The second thing I want to say about this is that these experiences are going to be presented to me by me in the way they're presented in therapy, in a sense, because I'm interested in their effect on psychological states. What's the effect on psychological growth of these experiences? It's a teleological question, and it underlies my comments. I was interested in how each stage of a numinous or mystical experience has an effect on the consciousness of an individual. Influenced obviously by my psychoanalytic orientation, because as Jung spoke about these things, Carl Jung, he said these kinds of experiences are, quote, the real therapy, because they have the most capacity to alter consciousness, which of course is the rubric of psychoanalysis and no doubt the rubric of all of the traditions that we talk about, and especially the one we were just speaking about before, to change consciousness. So in these interviews with 29 mystics, I was able to isolate 6 distinct states. Of course, they overlap, but within the one mystical experience with as much precision and as such events allow and language permits. They are, in summary, the initial onset of the experience. I'll summarize them and describe them. What occurs immediately after the onset, the state occurring as the peak experience is approaching, the peak experience itself, the coming out of it, and then the evaluation of it later on. The first stage of the 6, the onset of the experience, even for advanced meditators, no matter how advanced, those in monasteries who've been there for 20 years, it came upon them suddenly by surprise. They weren't aware it was going to happen. It came unbidden, much like a secession experience would come, or a gap would occur in consciousness, putting it into the Buddhist framework. As Rudolf Otto, who wrote that book on religious experiences so long ago, explained, that this overwhelming, this initial stage creates an awe, a fascination, some people fear. The stage takes place with a conceptual awareness. We're aware that's actually happening. There's a significant event that's occurring, but with little framing of what it is. All of a sudden, you're just overwhelmed. The second stage, immediately after that onset, is, I think for most people, a rapid attempt to try and put it into some context to allay their fears. After all, if you had an overwhelming experience, all of a sudden you were no longer in the same state. You'd sort of say, what's going on here? And I think that's recognized in mystical experiences. But most importantly is this, for this presentation, it's the third stage I want to talk about, and that exists just prior to the peak. And it's characterized by the extinguishment of all prior conscious positions held by the conscious mind. It takes the form of a moment of what we've been speaking about, no thought, no duality, and therefore no confusion. That confusion disappears as there's no mentation whatsoever. And it's here that this timeless moment, always reported as just a moment, brings on a noumenal nothingness. As one mystic in his book described it, he said, "There's nothing left which can be identified as I. Everything that is winks out, ceases to be, radically stops." So the question of who or what experiences this state is really one that's so confusing. In fact, when I wrote to a colleague and said that I was going to present this, he said, "Good luck with that," with an exclamation mark. If there's no mentation, if no thought, who can experience the nothingness? And indeed, can it be experienced? And briefly, because it's not part of this presentation, the fourth stage is the peak of the experience, where this void, the emptiness created by the involuntary winking out, of truth enters, a profound reality as to the fabric of mind and existence, conveyed without any imposition of thought, comes into one, and then in coming out of the state, the conscious mind immediately starts making sense of what occurred and starts struggling with it on a doctrinal basis. I mean, Aurobindo said this, as we experience our gods, so we create our heavens. You know, we all have a different view of the same thing. In fact, the entire event is really seen by many, except the experienced practitioners, as one sort of fluid event. But when it gets to the sixth stage, which is the final evaluation, even they actually turn it into a particular discourse as to what it really means, according to their tradition. That's why Gershom Scholem, the Kabbalistic scholar, provides there's no such thing as a mystical experience per se. There's, quote, only the mysticism of a particular religious system, Christian, Islamic, Jewish mysticism, and I'd add Buddhist and Hindu, and so on. And my research concluded, if you can take sitting with those 29 mystics, plus the work I do with patients who occasionally walk in and say, I've had this incredible experience. I was sitting on the sofa and all of a sudden I just experienced a sense of interconnectedness, and I'm sure many of you have had these experiences as well, that in that winking out stage, in that third stage, the experience of nothingness is indeed apprehended. At that instance, that moment, there is a subject and object, even though there's a winking out. So to start this analysis about who or what experiences nothingness, I want to approach the question of how can there possibly be any apprehension when in fact there's a winking out. The explanation that this noting occurs because the winking out conveys a sense of, I think it's the best explanation, because the noting is of a change of an underlying state. You go from a situation where you were having a particular sort of idea of what was going on, struggling for a solution, and all of a sudden it's a change of state, your mind has winked out. It's a single moment of apprehension, and it could possibly be that which occurs at the beginning of the suspension of consciousness, brought about by the winking out really because it's a change of state. In fact, William James accepts this. He said, the nothingness is noticeable because you get relief from the painful dualism of existence. You move yourself into a different area. So it's a new, unfamiliar event, and therefore most probable that at least at the onset of nothingness, there is a noting of it, an apprehension of it. It is the case also that the presentation of noting of experience of emptiness is a necessary function for the process and part of the arc of a mystical experience. It's necessary for it because it creates a basis for, so to speak, a clean position in which the reception of the truth can enter. Otherwise, the truth, which has elements of interconnectedness, we'd all agree, both in what you said so eloquently in terms of Japanese thought and other thought, the idea of there being an interconnectedness, however perceived, that realization of a unity, that non-duality, actually needs to enter into a clear position rather than one that's evaluating the whole thing. The other thing is, by suspending the ego mind, by having the winking out, there's a loosening of ego boundaries. You no longer have a defined sense of the small self, as we've been talking about. And that's been dissolved, so the winking out then is very functional. You must have a winking out. You must have something that's really dissolved. The other one is that this winking out, called in so many traditions non-duality, a void of acuity, is the needed receptacle for the truth that arrives to fill it. You take a journey, which is the essence of a mystical experience, from nothingness to fullness. That's the trip that you're actually going to traverse. So all of that is really not understood as the product of day-to-day outward-looking consciousness. And because it arrives to a mind that is disintegrated and empty from a psychological point of view, it appears that the realization is not coming from the normal view of outside by the conscious mind, but there's something going on intrapsychically with some impersonal aspect of the who, which actually is noting it. It appears then in my view, that the primary importance in a mystical experience is to be given to the noting of the emptiness, the noting of the nothingness, because otherwise there's no container for the truth to enter, as the evaluative mind, as we know, is constantly blurring all experiences. It's interesting, and I was speaking about it earlier, that the Ibn Arabi's work, the analysis of it, makes this noting of the emptiness the key position in terms of the effect of the mystical experience. And we're talking about Michael Sells, who wrote this book about Sufism. And in that book he said that the importance of the noting of the winking out is providing what he calls an identity shift that is the basis for the final stage that later occurs and reinforces it as a meaning event. Now, the doctrine of Sufi teaching, which you'll be hearing about, and forgive me for even interfering in what you're going to say, is basically the idea, to quote, that to reveal it to itself, through itself, its mystery is what Sufism is about. That is, the divine is revealing itself through itself to see its own mystery. And it's through, therefore, the agency of an individual who has, as the term goes, polished the mirror of the ego by his or her own purification that allows the divine to actually see themselves. Very much the point you were talking about early on, about the human requirement. Now, it's interesting that the most important state is the disappearing of the cohesive ego identity. That's the identity shift. Because at that stage, you can have a new identity where you can see yourself merely as an instrument of the divine. If you don't note that stage, then that effect could not necessarily happen. And it then takes form in what he calls later a semantic reenactment, where there's a tradition then where you move towards the letting go of the old identity to accept your proper role as that instrument to polish the mirror, both for you and for the community. So it's the noting of the loss of a personal ego that supplies the ultimate meaning. And the identity shift occurs, according to Sells, by a, quote, the art of apprehension, the noting of the emptiness, where, to quote him, quote, the dualisms of self-other, time and space are temporarily fused through the collapse of the semantic structures that reflect them. So in this view, in this concept, dualism is due to the collapse of it is due to the fundamental apprehension of the passing away of one's identity that can therefore create another, and that occurs by somehow apprehending the nothingness, losing your ego state. It's interesting that Sells suggests that in consideration of the question of who or what notes the nothingness, he says there's a double possibility. Quote, we should say it is both the divine and the human at the moment of polishing the mirror. So in any event, before touching on the idea of what is that he's referring to, it can be seen that the building blocks of framing a meaning event depend upon the awareness, the perception, or the noting of a change of state during the winking out, with the resultant momentary loss of ego and duality, which later, upon reenactment, would create the receptivity fully with embodiment within oneself of the truth that's transpired. There must be, according to that doctrine, a remembered perception of the winking out and a noting of it for its influence to be carried to the subsequent framing. I should pause to reinforce the fact that it's the case that a state of nothingness, the loss of mentation, the winking out, is in fact a universal and accepted aspect of a mystical experience. And we can frame it in terms of Buddhism, of those gaps in consciousness. Mahasi Sayadaw actually refers, in fact, to the apprehension of that nothingness as a key state. Aurobindo speaks about the fact that in his experience, which I'll actually perhaps quote, that he actually had the experience or the noting of the nothingness. So to keep the inquiry on track, because I can get bogged down in the doctrinal views, I want to repeat that in the final stages, it will always be given different meanings and always be given definitions and philosophically, and I want to avoid the phenomenological doctrine or epistemological ways of understanding these things. It is just a person's personal experience that there is that noting that's going to happen. You know, I mean, if I go into Vedanta, for instance, there are 11 different views as to what aspect of the who actually reveals an Atman and different forms of the Atman and so on. So I'm not speaking here of the final goal of enlightenment, but where there's an entry into a final non-duality or unconditioned mind, as you spoke about earlier, Ruben, but rather the noting of nothingness in a mystical experience. If that nothing is later assigned qualities, which is always will be in the final stage of evaluation, and in all our discussion we assign it some sort of qualities, we can call it the pre-existent, undifferentiated, eternal ground of being, what Jung calls the unus mundus, or the pleroma, or instead it could be said, using doctrinal approaches, that it's what's created by an ego trained for its own suspension, that it finally merges either with the highest self, and it's described, as we saw, in different subtleties, such as samadhi, nibbana, jnana, fana, satori, and so on. These latter positions, no matter what their apparent differences, however, are all based upon a noting or mindfulness of the switching off of the old cognitive configuration. A process of, which I like to hear the philosopher Simone Wheels calls the process of decreation, of everything being stripped away. So I want to go back into more detail, if I can do so, about what is it that notes nothingness if there's no conscious mind? I mean, if you think about it, if the mind switched off as we know it now, what possibly could be noting the nothingness? Even though we now, if you accept my thesis, we know that it's critical. If it is a who, we can't escape that the noting of the nothingness is some form of an individual experience in consciousness of a subject and object. But who then is the subject if it's not the conscious mind? In the mystical writing of Borges, and I thank Dean for putting me on to that, he suggests that in that moment, that noting, there is a fusing of subject and object, so that in the former, the mind actually exists, but in a much different form, because he says there's then no distance between the I and other. The noting on this interpretation occurs in the form of like a bare, untainted recognition of a loss of a conscious position, as that is necessary for the experience to have any efficacy. But you have to ask, what state could that possibly be? What does it mean to say that? And again, I mentioned Aurobindo, and he suggests that a different approach is necessary because there are different layers of mind. That's how he sees it. There's the gross level, the little mind, which made me rush over and get my donut, and that connected to the material aspect of life. Then in contrast, there's the higher mind, which is more in contact with the divine. And at the highest level of the higher mind, he says there's an ideal mind, which is an existence beyond and unconnected with the conceptual little mind. And he says it so beautifully. He says it's that which is unseen, unguessed by the blind, suffering world. And in his worldview, that ideal mind, what he calls the, quote, wide and witnessing self, and not the little mind or a lesser aspect of the higher mind that is carrying out the noting or apprehension. This is experienced by the mind through according to him, the agency of the highest aspect of the mind that exists in each of us, therefore works through us, through our being, to actually see what it wants to see. Now, for Jung and Freud, the Western idea of psychological development is that you must have a day-to-day conscious mind, because it's essential to any psychological progress that a phenomenon appear to the conscious mind that's capable of increasing or widening consciousness. That's why when you therapeutic involvement, you bring up things from the past, you bring up unconscious matters, they widen the conscious mind. They're available to the conscious mind from the unconscious, a term which embodies everything that we just don't know. Indeed, this is the basis of psychoanalysis, and there's no psychoanalysis or really clinical psychology without it. So there are many possibilities as to what aspects of the who can witness this change of state, and therefore be psychologically relevant in terms of creating a psychological growth. I mean, Nietzsche and Kant, they both had different approaches, because you have to approach it. You have no choice but to approach what's doing this. I mean, for Nietzsche, it was more of the bodily reactions, because he said with these kind of experiences you would get goosebumps, so therefore you get a sense of an occurrence, whatever that might be. Of course, we know for Kant it was this unity is this transcendental apperception arising from an inner sense, whatever that was. So the search for the participation of some form of cognition led Borges, where you remember the subject and object fused, to produce a different form of subject, to say that in the daily intellectual cognitive awareness there is, perhaps he says, that we're doing right now, there's selective attention. We're paying attention to some things as they're relevant to us and not, but when the mystical experience happens, it softens, and there's then what he calls a mystical intuition that we have, thus allowing the noting. But still, it's still the who. We haven't escaped from the who. We're just trying to find if there's something there in that ego-based conscious mind that we can then say, this is some lesser form, some fused form, some higher form that actually is noting. And even sensing and intuition require a cognitive mind, otherwise they pass through. Same way a dream, if it's not remembered, disappears. And I don't want to go again into the philosophical part of it. From a psychoanalytic point of view, I'm most concerned in what results in an alteration of consciousness, because after all, if you have a mystical experience and you have no awareness of it, or you have the experience of winking out, no awareness of that, what possible good does it have? It has no effect. So Jung actually scratched around for this, and he said, look, it doesn't matter if there's even, quote, an infinitesimal ego. If there's something there that can actually note it. But this conundrum, I think, can be solved, if I can be so bold, in one of two ways. The first, which I've been struggling with, is finding a lesser or a different form of conscious mind that's not intellectual, not evaluative, but yet contains some sort of higher perspective, as Aurobindo suggests, that would accommodate a loss of cognition. Or, on the other hand, an attribution of the awareness to the witnessing by a higher form of consciousness that is indwelling within one, the Atman, the like, that is indwelling in one, the divine or some innate transcendent nature, most often referred to there as the that, because it's no longer your mind, it's something which is operating within you, which is somehow has its own awareness. So examining the first solution that Borges suggests of a lesser or different form of ego, what could the other form of cognition be? What could that possibly be? And I think an interesting approach is a dream that Jung recalls of a patient who he says was a man riddled with resistances, where his dream evoked the number 4. The number 4 being the symbolic quintessence of wholeness. And Jung says, quote, "The thing which is meant in the dream," that's about the wholeness, "has nothing to do with the problem of his consciousness. It has to do with the center outside consciousness." This means, according to him, that there are two forces: that which creates the symbols, that which created the nothingness, that which created the whole truth that enters, and then the individual themselves. And he developed this notion of the fact that there is such a dimension within psyche, which he calls the self, with a capital S, to distinguish it from the smaller self that's been referred to so often, the self of the day-to-day, the making up of the sort of memories and reflections about what one is. And that self, he says, is not an aspect of the ego or the conscious mind, but exists within the realm of psyche. That's all that's known and unknown. And the normal first-person experience of cognition, the processes of mentation, the ego could not produce the symbolism. There's something else going on here. And very much this self is really a very strong idea that it's a centering function that we all have in us, which neurobiology has now confirmed, which Jung guessed was in the brainstem, and that primitive function actually is found to be in the brainstem. So we get, something happens to us, we get worn out, we go lie on the bed or, take it easy. We center ourselves, we bring ourselves back. And that actually formed, for him, the essence of the whole psychological process. The realization of that self, if you think about it, which is the something which is within us, which he compared very much to the Atman, as being the Hindu Atman, being something within us, that actually becomes the locus, and therefore one can surrender their ego to that possibility. And psychological growth then can occur towards the process of what he called individuation. Not the same as Eastern practices, but nevertheless a variation of that, although some have tried to make that bridge between enlightenment and individuation. Freud's idea, however, was that this observer in a dream is actually really a subordinate function, after all, of the ego. He saw it as the conscious mind operating really in a reduced form because it has fewer dimensions. It can't make decisions, it can't reflect. So according to Freudian commentators, this makes it a chimera with no psychic existence whatsoever, and just the ego projected onto the dream, in a dream situation. But it's not an easy question, because Jung describes that in most dreams there's still some consciousness of the ego, although it's very limited, and he says curiously distorted, known as the dream ego. It's a mere fragment of shadow of the waking ego, he says. Now, I find that very elusive, the idea that there's some lesser form of ego. And I prefer the idea that other commentators have said, that it's the dreamer's actual or felt sense of their own identity, which is in the dream. Or James Hillman has called it, it's like a wholly imaginal idea of something within us, in our dreams, which actually is noting what's actually occurring. It's not any aspect of the ego. So, if the who apprehends nothingness and one sense of identity, the idea of that's what's actually noting it, sort of, if you put that together with a dream ego hangs on a very thin thread, I think, because consciousness is really winked out. It's disappeared. So, let's see if I can attack that a bit more. We can say that the observer that perceives this state of nothingness can be like an observer in a dream, and not a complicated activity that is the waking ego. And I think the way that I approach it is when Freud described the existence of an unconscious ego sensor that inhibits certain dreams. He said that there's a sensor, so sometimes the dreams are too painful, they won't be allowed through. That's why many of them don't get through. But he expresses it that it's a means of describing a dynamic relationship within psyche during sleep. He says it this way, quote, I hope you do not take the term censorship too anthropomorphically, and do not picture the censor of dreams as a mere little mannequin or a spirit living in the closet in the brain and then discharging his office. For the time being, it is nothing more than a serviceable term for describing a dynamic relationship. And the debate that's followed over the last century as to the nature of this censor is questioned that it could have any agency, and but they then all draw upon the fact that it exists in some form and it's part of a wider intertwined process that goes on in psyche. So in Freudian terms, and to understand the nature of the who, the observer is what observes from a dynamic process, fulfilling a function, which is the mystical experience, to change consciousness, rather than it containing any superior transcendental agency or solidity within the realm of the ego. It can be said, if I use this reasoning, that there's always an experience of nothingness because it's necessary for the whole process to begin. But it's not to be associated with any activity of the waking mind. It's not the waking ego, it's not a variant of the ego, but it's part of an unknown process that occurs in creating the mystical experience. In this process, it's most likely that the observer is a sense, it may be, of identity that notes a changing state, but's necessary to participate dynamically in that process to have any relevance. Aurobindo, in his beautiful poem Savitri, explains it this way: it's in the absolute stillness bare and formidable, there was glimpsed, that's the word he used, glimpsed, an all-negating void supreme, the known unknown. So the dynamic process to have any required effect is a mystical experience, a religious experience, spiritual experience. To bring a mystery to consciousness must provide for that glimpse that creates an observer to make a known unknown. However, the glimpsing, if not by the ego as we know it, can be then said to be a that, not a who. Aurobindo doesn't accept that there is some functional lesser version of the ego, but he insists on the fact that there is an ideal mind of that, and he describes his own experience this way: I did not become aware of any pure I, nor even of any self, impersonal or other. There was an awareness of that, with a capital T, as the sole reality. It was a nameless consciousness which was not other than that. One could perhaps say this, though hardly even so much as this, since there is no mental concept of it, but not more. Mark that I do not think these things. There are no thoughts or concepts, nor did they present themselves like that to me. It simply just was so, and was self-apparently to me. So let me talk about the experience of that. How am I doing for time?
You've got a good 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
Questions.
Okay, perfect. So the shift from a personal noting of nothingness, by some form, vague as it is, of the ego, to the idea that there's a that, a witness which arises within us, is natural for certain reasons. That is, in psychological terms, an extrapolation or a projection of a higher power derived from an overwhelming change of state that has arrived unbidden. All of a sudden, you're overcome by this. It's a highly dramatic, for any of you who have had them, direct experience of the onset of the mystical experience and of the nothingness. How many times a day do you otherwise suspend your conscious mind? Don't answer the question. It raises a possibility then of a grand mover or something other, something that creates the experience that holds all truths, which is then going to dispense to you, standing behind the experience as its instigator and its witness. It's a natural conclusion that the powerful revelation, its purpose, is beyond the capacity of a limited, flawed individual. It's actually a very small step psychologically to move someone from the idea of the ego being in charge to the idea that the self is in charge, or that the that is the witness of nothingness. Because as there's no ego with nothingness, it follows that the witness can't be explained by rational thought, except by these theories, as a bounded ego of some sort, and the idea of a projective identity imposed in a dynamic experience to make it a function for everybody you would talk to about this would be too abstract. That was the only logical explanation, that in quotes, due to the magnitude of the revelation. Since it's indeed noted, nothingness must always be an object, and therefore you have to attribute it to a source, and the that as a subject gives substance to what is otherwise ineffable. So in many religious and spiritual traditions, the that supersedes and replaces the elements of the direct first-person experience of nothingness, even though it's been observed and has contributed to a sense of unity, because attribution to a prime mover confers upon it automatically, if you think about it, agency, and that it can, in fact, be behind the observer and organize your life and be the one that notes this. This is not, however, outside doctrinal or convenient explanations an easy solution, because the existence of that requires constant reinforcement as a matter of faith, as a matter of belief, as a matter of ideation. Pierre Bourdieu, who explains that any named intrapsychic object, such as a that, can become, quote, camouflage. Though present as substance, they're absent as form, like a face hidden in a bush. Now, I say nothing of the theological veracity and importance of that. However, I'm indicating psychologically, at least, which is my way that I approached it, how the transition from a personal, subjective experience of nothingness, the who, to the idea of a prime mover, the that, occurs by merely giving it a name. Trying to give it a name for something otherwise inexplicable. A quest to experience is a function of many non-Buddhist traditions, of Vedic and other spiritual traditions, although its experience is exceedingly rare. The consequence of the idea of that, as it points outside the person to the agency of that, and then we're led on a path of the discovery of that. We want to know what that is. As observed in the case of many of the 29 mystics, the life-changing power of the mystical experience was only seen as a very small step on the way to their final realization of that, which I believe is impossible for a Westerner, causing endless longing rather than resting in what's experienced. My impression is that this often causes dissatisfaction. And it was interesting, of 29 mystics, I wound up doing a mini therapy session for about 20 of them. There's a high degree of sitting there all the time, and these are all Western mystics who are in these monasteries. It's very difficult to keep doing that, because the peace arising from what they have been observed is not enough. That's just a stage on the way that they have to go. So the idea of that being very elusive is really something which, as far as psychology is concerned, and I'll skip this, but it's really what Jung proposed as a way to deal with the duality through the centering function. He called it a that and made it the most important aspect of psychoanalysis, because it draws to it what is necessary to provide balance. But in this case, it's experienced through dreams and through unconscious material. I was going to give you, we don't have the time, but I was going to give you the situation with a patient who came in. I've already written about this in a book I did on the self, who had this dream. I can't resist telling it to you, and you pull the plug when it's time. He came in, he had no concept of why he was really there, just that he had broken up, and his relationship was over, and he had a very low-level job. And first dream was that he was in Ultimo. Those of you in Sydney know there's a place called Ultimo, but he'd never been to Ultimo. And what happened was there was a series of concentric circles, and in the middle of the circle there was a red little circle, and if he stood on it, he can go back in time and look at all his past without any effect. Now, where did that come from? I mean, where could something like that possibly come from? And the symbol is, according to Jung, the symbolization of the circle and a center, which indicates the process of the self, a centering function, began to open up the analytical process for him. It began to introduce him to the idea that he can go back in time and look at these things and start unfolding things. But again, it did so because of the that. So therefore, it's a bit easier, I feel, in psychoanalysis, although it's a different orientation, to move individuals towards the concept of the fact that there's a that, as opposed to a situation where you have a mystical experience and you're in a religious or spiritual tradition and you look at where that fits in terms of what you've done. Or you're told, Vipassana, for instance, ignore that and move on to sensations in the body and so on. So it actually, as applied to nothingness, doesn't need to be seen as the work of some form of ego, but rather that there is a that. So let me round it up by, I wanted to say something about the nature of the that within us. What is that that? Aurobindo, when he has experience, said that it was in a mind now seeming like a vast empty room. And the reality is that the key to this experience is that there's a message presented of the loss of ego boundaries. The presentation of the noting is the ego boundaries, which leads to the interconnectedness. And in the 80 or so mystical experiences I heard, and plus the historical ones that I researched, in my own experience and those of patients, almost all of them have the same sense that what was being presented came from outside them. And I'd be interested to hear your own experience was pushed into them in a form that they could evoke, where it could be evoked in themselves. So nothingness in its function and effect has content, even if it's not symbolized specifically, or it doesn't exist, or one of the monks who had this experience in Cambodia said that when he had it, he was also peaceful and had no pain. He described it as lying back in a warm bath. He could let go at long last of all these things that were happening to him. Maybe I'll conclude with just, I had a long way to go, but I offer this conclusion. The analysis of the states of the mystics, my experiences, those of patients, the apocryphal stories so easily available, the experience of Nisargadatta, of Ramana Maharshi, all of those things, when you put them together, and the same can be said for Sufism, for mystical Christianity, for Taoism, for Kabbalah, and all aspects of Hinduism, as well as Jungian analysis, is that it's all to do with different levels of the soul. Notice I excluded Buddhism in this. It's to do with different levels of the soul. And the moment you start talking about that, you've already stepped into the boundary of looking at that is very important. A mystical experience, once it's been discussed and becomes part of an individual's identity, therefore will merge as one narrative amongst others. And in my work, the degree of its function will depend on the extent of the longing of the individual, both from developmental factors, but also the power of the experience that arises from the noting of nothingness. If a person has great longing, the possibility of the mystical experience coming again is there. And I try to, in another book, truly figure out why are people receptive to these things and how in fact it works. I talked about the other night, speaking with some people, about this man who had a vision of sitting in a park in New York and had a vision of the Virgin Mary that appeared, was 20 foot high and wasn't transparent but looked solid to him. And I said, well, what do you make of that? And he said, well, I was having California rolls, so it was the crab stick. And it really led me, any attempt to question him thereafter about it, go crab stick. And therefore the question really is not so much we have these experiences, not so much that we speculate about nothingness. The real question for me is whether or not that possibility can enter ourselves, whether or not we can in fact attribute it to something so great that we're willing to accept that that's actually what exists within us. The miracle of nothingness is essential to create the expansion of consciousness. Without that experience, then I think that what happens is we have no chance of really experiencing the possibilities that exist. So maybe I'll stop there, and certainly interested to hear any experiences you had or comments that you want to make.
Stage 2 or part 2. Do you want to expand on that just a wee bit for me?
Well, let's say right now, as you're sitting here, all of a sudden you feel completely overcome by what's going to turn out to be a revelation of a truth, but you don't know that. For experienced practitioners, they were already sort of accustomed to it, but it comes to you. It might be awe that you experience, but you could also experience fear. What is it that's happening? Because there's no way that you can stop that. It's not as if you say, "Oh no, I don't want that mystical experience right now. Please disappear." You know, I mean.
Because in mine, there was no process like that. It just suddenly came, and I felt suspended. I mean, there's no words to it.
Right.
So, and it was as if there was this linking with everything. It was incredible, and it lasted for a few months.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering how that is it the right word then? Fear.
Is what?
Is it the right word? Fear.
Well, in your case, it wasn't.
Yeah.
But I've certainly experienced with many people say, "Oh my God, I got to have a session. I'm going crazy. I had this experience where something overwhelmed me, and I felt a sense of interconnectedness. But what could that be? You know, maybe I'm going psychotic." Yeah. But when you had your experience, you described it as a single narrative, which is what it was for you. And the truth of the interconnectedness becomes a thing that was most important, which sort of in a way changes all the various little parts that happen, like you mentioned, the initial overwhelming and so on. So that's why I chose these people who have multiple mystical experiences, because they're used to them, and they're able to sort of say what the various states over time had been. They broke down the single narrative into individual components. So the nothingness would have had to have happened in some form or another in order for you to be able to take your normal position, which is, let's say, everything's not interconnected, to all of a sudden seeing that everything is interconnected. So there had to be a vacation or an evacuation of what your normal point of view would be.
Yeah, it was at all time, in that no time.
Right.
I knew that I was me, although kind of not me.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's what I've been trying to address. Yeah, it's not as if this is the answer. You can all stop now looking at this. but nevertheless, that's the result of listening to all these mystics. And it's interesting. You take somebody I met who was from Germany, who had been at Ajahn Chah's monastery, which is a Theravadan monastery outside Bangkok, and been there for 20 years. And I did ask him, by the way, I said to him, "Could I ever be like you?" And he said, "No." He said, "Because I've got a bricklayer's mind." He said, "You don't have that. You can't have those states. You're thinking too much." But nevertheless, he was able to say, "Look, I've had so many of these experiences along the way. In his particular derivative of the process, they weren't relevant. They were transient gaps, you might call them, in consciousness. But nevertheless, he was able to explain very carefully, because he had so many, the kind of way in which they sort of were broken down over time."
Yeah, for me, sorry, but it felt like as if something else was breaking through
Totally.
into my reality.
Totally, that's a proper, full mystical experience,
Yeah.
that it was actually in control, showing you the interconnectedness.
Yes, that's right.
Right.
Sorry.
I was just going to say, there's an interesting. Sorry, Harold, I know you're next, but there was William James in that Richardson biography of William James. He mentions that William James had this situation of terror where he couldn't figure out the difference between dreaming and waking and what was him and what was the world outside and these kind of things. And you mentioned Ibn Arabi. So Ibn Arabi's definition of a mystic, he uses dreams as a way of defining a mystic. He says, look, when you're in a dream, you know it's entirely you. You know it's just your mind, and yet it feels like you are a conscious, aware being going around in this world as if the world is external. The mystic is somebody who does that in ordinary waking life and treats the waking life as a dream as well.
But that's a rare end product. In all the travels to these monasteries and maybe going 30 odd times to India and interviewing people various times, I've yet to meet someone. It's like the goal in Jungian analysis to become individuated. And I was saying the other day to Harold, whenever I give a talk, I said, anybody who's individuated, could you raise your hands, please? You never get anybody who's going to answer that. I think it's a work in progress, and I think he was referring to one who's in that state all the time, such as Ramana Maharshi or some of the great Sufi saints. But for most of us, the odd mystical experience is the gifts we're going to get.
Harold?
Leslie, can I ask you, you were talking to these 29 people?
Yeah, many more, but they were the only ones who were.
Oh, and these were people who have mystical experiences, many of them, and before you went to them?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So did you also talk to them about the period in time before they had the first one?
Yes.
And the question that I would have then is, do you find some common characteristics in this prehistory to the first?
I did.
Which ones?
Well, this is in that book that I did, Working with Mystical Experiences, because I had my example of the man who saw the Virgin Mary, and I was puzzled why they had that. And that's why it had to do with the degree of longing. And I found that, first of all, there was for all the men, and it was half men, half women, but for all the men, there was a father hunger. And D.T. Suzuki actually said he spent his whole life looking for his father, which brought him in that direction. That was the first thing I saw. That not all of them, but majority of them, because there was something that had a longing that develops. And the second thing I saw, and again, this is not research the same way that that we were talking about the research before, but then for many of them, or most of them again, there was this situation where they had become very involved with the mother, their mother, almost as a confidant, but then the mother withdrew that, creating a deeper longing, which is Jung's situation, of course, because he disrespected his father and his mother did seances and so on. Or Aurobindo experience, his father sent him away and his mother became depressed and was hospitalized. D.T. Suzuki's and so many more that we can go through of their lives of having that kind of thing. So these were people who weren't just going to India like I was, passing through. They were people who had said, that's it, this is my life now. I'm going to do just this. Yeah.
Interesting. So some kind of crisis situation, more generally speaking.
Well, not an acute crisis, but an ongoing,
yes.
ongoing,
Right.
situation.
Is that the link between the two groups, between the patients and the mystics? Because it's such a weird parallel that you're implicitly drawing on. It's completely natural that we hear about mystics you visited in order to get them to talk about this, and patients who presumably come to you in order to get help with a life situation, and you've been treating them as almost parallel?
No, no. But because what happens is they're not talking about them in the same way, the patients, of course. They're talking about them in terms of a functional thing. What does this mean about the state that I'm in? And what does this mean for my psychological growth? Or how does this affect me? Why did it happen now at this particular time? Or what are the symbolic elements of the dream? So they're handled much differently. This was just me sitting around, if you picture in India, in the Kumbh Mela with 30 million Indians and me, and sitting there with the chai, with the coffee, squatting on the ground and talking to them about their experiences. So it wouldn't pass the research test, you know. But just I was trying to get but it was so consistent, constantly consistent. I mean, I went down to Pondicherry, where Aurobindo's place, went to where Ramana Maharshi's ashram still lies, went all the way through Varanasi, spoke to sadhus, and same feeling all the time about people saying, well, I do experience, I am aware of that momentary emptying of things, not necessarily as strictly as I'm expressing it, but a moment where I know that there's a winking out, but I'm aware of it. I'm aware of it. The identity shift, and you were going to ask me something.
Yeah, excellent, thank you. So you mentioned the stages of the mystical experience. So we have the emptying process,
right.
and then the peak experience, the content comes, and then we have the doctrines coming and explain what's going on.
Right.
And often they rely on their own religious doctrinal beliefs, so
Absolutely.
we have the different experiences, as Sholan mentioned. So we have also, on the other hand, the theory of the so-called constructivist theory, which argues that the beliefs were already there before the experience, right? So, and in order to have that experience, you have some expectations about what counts for the mystical experience or not. So for that reason, the doctrines will actually shape the experience itself, right? So that will bring us the idea that we will be finding mystics, they will talk about the ineffable, the nothingness and stuff. Those negative concepts might be in fact negations of different stuff.
Yeah,
so what do you think about
no,
that?
it's certainly not that case.
Yeah.
Because the reason is that every time, we're just talking about mystical experience is not the end product of some form of enlightenment or arahat experience. What happens is for every mystical experience, just as it happened with the one that was explained so well, you're overwhelmed. It all of a sudden comes upon you. And there is a moment where you actually, according to this delineation, there's a moment where you attempt to frame it. And for those who are already have preconceptions because they're part of a movement or otherwise, they'll start to frame it in that way immediately. But then all of that disappears, and they, in a sense, cleaned out before the actual truth arises. Because otherwise the truth will arise in different ways. But the truth of interconnectedness seems to be in every experience. And there's no experience without that interconnectedness. So that arrives with a clean mind. You can't interpret that in any way. But after the cases, Sholan says, I mean, then you give it. And as you're coming out of it, I don't know if you notice, as you're coming out of it, you start giving it understanding. Say, oh, that's what that is. That's what happened. Before you give it a later explanation and you read about it and wonder what happened to you. So on the coming out, it comes in as well. It's a very subtle thing. And this is how it was explained to me. As you're going into it, you have these preconceived notions, then they're gone. Then you have the experience and the preconceived notions creep back in immediately. But it's an interesting thing that when how different they are, because when the Sagayananda Bharati is just one example, started talking about his experience of nothingness, and he wasn't talking about gaps in consciousness or secession experiences. They actually, as he writes, they actually thought he was mad and he had to leave because they were sort of questioning him whether he should see somebody and so on, because the experience was so different in the end. But in the end, it comes ultimately to one narrative. And the narrative is the interconnectedness. That's what everybody remembers about it.
I think you said that most of these mystical experiences, people said they were coming from the outside.
Yes.
Well, that's interesting because usually it's going out of the self, like Plotinus, for example, and the notion of ecstasy. The word means going outside of yourself, standing outside of yourself.
Right.
So I'm looking to see how they're describing it in relationship to how others.
No, I never meant outside yourself. It's actually, that's why you attribute it to that within you. Because it's the experience of something that came from outside or within you as the thing. For instance, you tell me if I'm wrong, but in the case of Sufism, the whole idea is that all of this is orchestrated by the divine in order for it to see itself more clearly in the polished mirror. So there's a that which is external. But in Hindu delineation, there's the Atman, which actually is the doer of deeds, and which leads you into all the various positions you have to get into in order for this to actually occur. So, but I think it's again a doctrinal difference.
It was in what you described in stage 6.
Sorry. Yes, exactly.
Stage 6. I realised that there was no outside.
Right. So then you get question.
Only the in here.
You get the question, what is inside that's doing it?
Sorry?
Then you get the question of what inside is doing it.
On evaluation, on thinking of it, I later recall that, in Luke 17:21 it says that the kingdom of God is within you, and I thought, that's what he kind of meant.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's in fact what Jung said. Eventually, what this self is the God within us.
That's right.
Yeah, but once you experience that, the question then is whether one gives over to that as doing everything, bringing you to this conference, asking these questions, doing all those things.
Mm-hmm.
That's the transition, I think, which actually is the hard one, because it's so alien for us to actually, it's in a matter of function and belief and faith, and you have to have it all, because the experience fades, the mystical experience then becomes a story that happened to you.
Yeah, with me it was realising that I was a very vulnerable person, and that I was with millions of other vulnerable people.
Yeah.
And we needed compassion.
I respect that insight. Yeah, it's really, that's exactly what we are.
All right. We'll leave it there. Thanks.
Okay.
Okay, maybe just a couple of minutes to grab teas while we set Graham up.
Sure.
In your practice, psychoanalysis, have you ever had a patient who didn't believe they, the patient, okay.
So, Dean, my computer's in my room. It's Mac. Okay, so if I go and get it, where do we set up? What's that? Where do we set up? Right here. Oh, okay. So what are you looking at the system?
It's HDMI cable.
Okay.
Have you got a port for it? If you don't, I've got a adjust.
Yeah.
If it's relatively new, I think you've got it.
No, it's an old machine.
Oh, okay.
But it's a VGS card. Where's the connector?
It's the only one we've got. The only cable we've got is HDMI. So
Okay.
maybe if you can put it on a memory stick and stick it onto here.
That will make sense, yeah, because it's not that connected. Right. So let me go and put it on. Yeah, okay.
Is that
5 minutes? 5 minutes.
I think they're right. It's like, it's the one indisputable fact. Like,
I'm jealous.
that may not even be there, but my experience is right.
Sorry. Hello. What's your name? My name is Idol. Very good. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. Yeah, so I'm working in the factory. Yeah, because for 6 years I'm living in Australia. I work at Monash. Yeah. No, I came much after university. Yeah, and I did Islamic studies. Yeah. So yeah, everything is going well. What about you?
Well, I've retired from transition.
I came to Australia and the garden
Yeah, but I'm doing it as inspired by that. Oh. Yeah, oh, yes, I know.
I don't know, I'm not published with them.
all of the chaos, all of the anxiety, they just perception.
What is it? I mean, we're talking about this like question about
Yeah, we can talk a lot. The first thing that I ever read was the 45 in the center. It was a very famous 13th century Turkish word. Yeah, as kids they began to memorize. The first thing that I read was
very deep, and also, of course,
All different ways.
of course. Oh, exactly.
Yeah, well, we're all talking about using where we ended up on Wednesday.
Well, another part you have to go around. Some people well, you got this stuff. We had like this. There's so much fusion. So much culture.
that is very interesting.
When are you presenting?
You will be around.
Oh, yes. Jared is presenting on the third day as well. See you later.
Wednesday.
I'm home again. Sleeping in my room again.
yeah, sure.
So you'll have to correspond.
No, right.
Out the front door. Walk a long way down the road. Just keep walking down the road. Okay. Yeah. Past the beautiful
No, I haven't.
There's a little tiny maze. It's really pretty. It's like if you look at the Bloomsbury house.
Yes.
Yeah, you will feel it like that. And then the pool's just further down. It's
No.
not very long, but you can sometimes.
Social consciousness.
It's just one room to the next room.
Yeah.
Like it was just like loss of consciousness and they disappeared, like doing nothing. I just don't think that